Buonasera, benvenuti al nostro ennesimo incontro del seminario di storia del papato. Quest'anno, questo mese avremo 2 incontri a breve distanza, quello di oggi e quello di martedì 5. E per me è un grande onore accogliere nel nostro seminario Anna Blennow, che viene dall'Università di Göteborg, dove si è laureata nel 2006 su una tesi appunto di epigrafia latina a Roma, quindi esperta di latino e di epigrafia, e che ha lavorato ad argomenti veramente molto interessanti e anche all'avanguardia, anche in vista del Giubileo, un bellissimo lavoro visto sulle la tradizione delle guide per turisti a Roma, da cui è stato edito un volume per De Gruyter nel 2019 e anche una mostra. E guida anche questo gruppo internazionale di ricerca sulle iscrizioni latine che è iscritta, e questa sera ci parlerà di un argomento veramente molto interessante, che è il rapporto tra topografia ed epigrafia nelle collezioni altomedievali. Uno dei modi in cui è stata narrata e rappresentata la nostra città di Roma per secoli attraverso la trasmissione dei testi scritti, e le sillogi di epigrafi hanno avuto un ruolo importantissimo. Quindi è con enorme piacere che do la parola alla professoressa Blennow. The floor is yours.
Grazie molto, professor Verardi, grazie professor Bucarelli. I will now speak in English. I will try to speak as clearly as possible, and I hope you all can follow me. So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here with you tonight. So in this engraving in the picture from 1575, we see the city of Rome. Or do we, really? There are no buildings apart from a selection of churches depicted in a very large scale, free of any surrounding urban structure, more like landmarks or icons. Outside some of the churches, their patron saints are seen welcoming the visiting pilgrims. And the names of the churches are written out in the image as identifying signs. But there are almost no traces of roads and streets. The churches are instead joined together by the streams of people, of pilgrims moving between each of the churches. They arrive from the north, which is in the lower left corner in the image, and then walk around the city along previously beaten paths in order to fulfill their pilgrimage. And it is only by moving and by performing the correct rituals in the correct places that Rome comes into being. So let's keep this image with us during the lecture about how Rome was constructed by reading, by writing, and by movement during the Middle Ages, and how the popes acted within these networks of movement, within these networks of reading and writing through the medium of epigraphy. When visiting a foreign town, such as Rome is for many, in the Middle Ages as well as now, the traveler is surrounded by, aided by, or confused by a universe of texts. Translated texts, unintelligible texts, misinterpreted texts, ceremonial texts, instructive texts in the urban landscape, or texts in pocket-sized guidebooks, a genre that has kept amazingly stable through the centuries. Here to the right in the image, the lower right, we see one of the earliest examples from around the year 800 in the manuscript called Einsiedeln number 326, kept in the abbey with the same name in Switzerland. And also, as in the image we saw initially, also simply following along the networks of movement constructed by other groups of people on the move will eventually, together with all these texts, lead us to the places that ought to be seen, be it a pilgrim site in medieval Rome or the Fontana di Trevi of Rome today. The Middle Ages, of course, was a period when very few had access to the written word in the form of books and manuscripts. But that did not mean that a medieval visitor to Rome would lack the opportunity to inform themselves about the places that they were about to encounter. Rome was built by the written word also outside of the books. So let's now have a look at which kinds of textual landscapes that surrounded the medieval visitor to Rome, and what kind of knowledge that was established or activated by the very visit. How did text and place interact with each other and with the reader or traveler? And how did new texts as well as new topographical structures appear out of this interaction? Pilgrimage to Rome, as you all know, was undertaken early on in the history of Christianity, but the real boom for pilgrimage came in the early Middle Ages from the 6th, 7th century and on. And people from all social levels were able to make a pilgrimage, both men and women, rich and poor, laymen and clergy, and pilgrimage could even be used as punishment for crime, for example, for people coming from Northern Europe. Usually pilgrims traveled in groups, and along the way through Europe the borders lay open if you only had a pilgrim pass issued by the local church at home. And simple meals and dormitories were also available for free during the journey, even in the very city of Rome, with a limitation that you could only stay for a fixed number of days there. So, a medieval pilgrim would, in the 7th century and on, typically have arrived from the north along the Via Flaminia. Lodgings were to be found in the Borgo, close to St. Peter's, San Pietro, where national pilgrim hostels were established early on. The average pilgrim would, of course, not have had access to guide texts and written itineraries, but individuals were probably to be found here in the hostels, laymen or clergy that could inform you about the way, perhaps even leading groups through Rome. The capacity to read and write must have varied enormously among all the pilgrims. The level of literacy among them can be deduced, though, through the many textual traces that they left on their journey, guiding texts that they used, guiding texts that they in turn wrote after their own journey, transcriptions of Latin inscriptions they found along the way, and even graffiti scratched into the walls of the sacred places that they visited. The earliest written pilgrim itineraries for the city of Rome that we know of were composed in the 7th century, and they were of crucial importance for shaping the routes that would be re-established again and again through the constant movement of the pilgrims. The sacred places that a pilgrim was supposed to visit lay for the most part outside the city walls, where the catacombs and basilicas with martyr tombs were situated. And of course, as you all know, this came from the fact that ancient Rome did not allow burials inside the city walls. Thus, the routes went around the city in a circular movement outside the walls, as in 3 guide texts from the 7th century, which I will present briefly here. Notitia Ecclesiarum Urbis Rome, Notes on the Churches of Rome, which starts at Via Flaminia in the north and then moves clockwise around the city with the major roads as landmarks and end at St. Peter's. De locis sanctis martyrum, que sunt foris civitatis Rome, on the holy places of martyrs that are situated outside the city of Rome, which starts at St. Peter's but instead moves counterclockwise around Rome, using the same major roads for orientation. And the third one, the so-called Malmesbury itinerary, preserved in William of Malmesbury's Gesta Regum Anglorum of the 12th century, but believed to be derived from the 7th century, which starts at St. Peter's and also moves clockwise. And in addition to the main roads, this itinerary also uses the city gates for orientation. But of course, this circular movement did not form quite a perfect circle. This is a work I am occupied with at the moment, trying to reconstruct the route of the Notitia Ecclesiarum in further detail. So as you see, you start at the north, you come to the Porta di Popolo, then you go out to the Catacomb of San Valentino, then you go to the east and eventually reach the Via Salaria, where you go out from the city, then to the right, and you meet Via Nomentana, then you go back. So it's a very intricate pattern of streets and roads, if you look closely at it. But what kind of information did the pilgrim find in these texts? Here are examples from these three texts for the same area in Rome regarding pilgrim sites at the Via Ardiatina, south of Rome. So, for example, in the Notitia Ecclesiarum, you leave the Via Appia behind and come to St. Marcus, Pope and Martyr, and then to St. Damasus, Pope and Martyr on the Via Ardiatina. And there, in another church, you find two deacons and martyrs, Marcus and Marcellianus, twin brothers, whose bodies rest above under the great altar. Then you descend by stairs to the holy martyrs Nereus and Acleus. And more or less the same information is found also in the other text. So, as you can see, the information contained in these texts is really very brief. Only some exhortative verbs of motion, together with adverbs of direction and place, guide the reader forward. The places to visit are connected by vicinity. So close to this, you have that, and then you go on in small parts of the way, one at a time. And the text forms a kind of chain of topographic locations that together form an itinerary that is possible to follow without maps, actually. And rather than the catacomb names that we are familiar with today, which were established at a later time, it is the very names of the saints that are signifying the stops along the way. Thus, the pilgrimage describes sort of a personal visit to each of the saints rather than a geographic, more neutral description. And all these references to the saints established knowledge networks of history and of memory, and placed the reader and the traveler in an ongoing performative memory act. But how would the pilgrim get further information about all these various saints, apart from the very brief information in the guide texts? We can imagine that on the sites, information could be gained in various ways, for example, from personal guides, but also from another important communicative medium, inscriptions. Several centuries before the earliest preserved guiding texts, in the 4th century, grand activities were initiated in making the catacombs into functional and informative cult places. This is the time when Pope Damasus, as you surely know, started a vast restoration project in many catacombs, embellishing them and making them more accessible for visitors. But above all, he brought a brand new level of literacy into the catacombs. He composed and commissioned around 40, possibly more, long Latin inscriptions in verse, praising the deeds of the saints and telling their stories. We even know the name of the stone cutter who produced the elaborately decorative letters, Furius Dionysius Philocalus, who signed some but not all of the inscriptions. These verse inscriptions of Damasus served several purposes. They were decorative and solemnly monumental. They contained information about the marchers, and they, of course, also put the light on Pope Damasus himself. But to us, these inscriptions also make clear that even before Damasus' interventions, a lot of people already visited the catacombs at the time. For of what use would this epigraphic program be if no one would be there to see and read it? The epigraphic practice of Pope Damasus is a perfect example of the concept epigraphic habit, established by historian Ramsay MacMullen in 1982 in an influential article, the name of which you have here in the slide. The object of MacMullen's study was Latin inscriptions from the classical period, and he focused on the question of why the custom of making funerary inscriptions spread so fast over the Roman Empire in the 2nd century, in the Common Era. And since then, epigraphists such as Elizabeth Meyer, Greg Wolfe, and John Bodell have developed the concept even further. But central to this theory is the concept of sense of audience, exactly what Damasus was after. If a lot of people were not already coming to the sacred places in the catacombs, no one would have seen and read his inscriptions. The use of the catacombs and the venerated places were already there in place, but by creating his epigraphic program, Damasus consolidated it further for centuries to come. And just to show the vastness of Damasus' project, here is an image of all the interventions of Damasus, which are the orange circles, and all the known inscriptions, preserved or not, marked out as red dots. And if we move a couple of centuries forward to the 7th century, Pope Honorius I was another important actor in preserving and creating structures at the pilgrim sites, both in the catacombs and in churches, also inside the city walls. And his projects surely contributed to what the average pilgrim wanted to and was expected to visit. Some of his building activities are noted in the Notitia Ecclesiarum, as you see here in the image, a text which otherwise, as we saw before, provides very few informative facts. But here we can see that San Valentino, Sant'Agnese, and San Pancrazio were restored or built anew by Honorius, and also that these places were unusually beautiful. And this focus on the works of Honorius, of course, points to that the Notitia Ecclesiarum probably was composed in the years around Honorius' pontificate. And he was one of the greater building popes, so to speak. On this map, you can see some of the interventions he did. Oh, it's the next map. There you go. He remade the old Senate house in the Forum into the church of Sant'Adriano. He built or restored San Pancrazio, restored or rebuilt San Valentino, built the church of Sant'Agnese fuori le mura, Santa Lucia in Selcis, and an underground basilica in the catacombs of Santi Marcellino e Pietro, among other things. But apart from that, he also renewed papal interest in poetic inscriptions as a medium for information and propaganda. And as red dots here in the image, we can see the 7 epigraphic epigrams that were written, or sometimes probably written, by Honorius. In San Pietro, 2 funerary inscriptions for his papal predecessors Deus Dedit and Bonifacius V. 2 inscriptions on a silver door in the old San Pietro. 3 inscriptions in Sant'Agnese on Via Nomentana, of which 2 were mosaic inscriptions. 1 at San Paolo fuori le mura and 1 at San Pancrazio, also that are mosaic apse inscriptions. So, as seen from this image, his interventions still were made mainly outside the walls, which aligns him with the same topographical visions as Pope Damasus. And he aimed for even more precious materials than the marble of Damasus, silver doors inlaid with gems, mosaics glittering in gold. So these inscriptions were surely very visually striking. And here you can see one of them, the well-known apse mosaic in Sant'Agnese fuori le mura, where Pope Honorius is depicted to the left of Saint Agnese in the middle. And a part of this very, one must say, splendid poem, the golden image rises from cut stones, and the very daylight is at once embraced and confined. You would suppose dawn was springing up from clear white fountains, moistening the fields with dew as the clouds are swept away. Very, very poetical. And also, of course, he underlines himself as a patron and composer of the inscription in the end. These consecrated gifts Pope Honorius has given. But this is actually the only one of the Honorius inscriptions that is preserved today. And it's not quite in its original state. It has been also restored at later times. All the other Honorian inscriptions, as far as I am informed, are known only from transcriptions made in the Middle Ages, the so-called Sylogai, early collections of transcribed Latin inscriptions. There are quite a few of them. Here I have picked out 4 of the most famous of them, and also the ones believed to contain the oldest material. The manuscripts themselves date from the 9th to 12th centuries, but however, researchers such as Giovanni Battista de Rossi and Angelo Silvagni meant that all of these Sylogai, in fact, were transcriptions of older texts from the 7th century. So everything was just a transcription of this old material, which means the same period as the Notitia Ecclesiarum. And you also see how they look like. We have the Syloge Laures Hamensis there to the right. And in these collections of inscriptions, the major interest focuses upon exactly the poetic inscriptions produced by Damasus and Honorius, among others, and their stories of the saints. So these text collections actually testify to the fact that the more literate of the pilgrims actually paid very close attention to the epigraphic texts that they met on their journey. And thus we can see that the instructive epigraphic programs of Popes Damasus and Honorius worked exactly as they were supposed to do, producing veneration and information at the same time. Another important sylogy from the period is this one, the manuscript number 326 in the library of Einsiedeln Abbey in Switzerland, which we saw briefly in the beginning of the lecture. We do not know where it was originally produced, even if southern Germany has been proposed by some researchers, but the manuscript itself is dated to the 9th century, and it is a compilation manuscript with several parts. So one part is the Syloge, the collection of inscriptions, and another part is a list of around 10 itineraries through the city of Rome. So here we see a spread with the itineraries to the left and the inscription collection on the right. These itineraries are not only the earliest source for many of Rome's medieval churches, they also testify about the status of Rome's ancient monuments, because they too appear here side by side with the Christian monuments. And the Einsiedeln manuscript has therefore been studied more in topographical than epigraphic research. But the inscription collection, the Syloge of the Einsiedeln manuscript, is also very important, because both the itineraries and the Syloge includes ancient monuments and inscriptions, not only late antique and medieval ones. In fact, this is the first topographical text that we know of that includes both Christian and pagan material, both ancient and medieval. And the Syloge is also the only source for many now lost Latin inscriptions. About half of the 80 inscriptions in this collection are now lost and have been a very long time too. Another important fact here is that both the itineraries and most of the inscriptions in the Einsiedeln manuscript are situated inside Rome, inside the walls. The topographical focus had by the Carolingian period, which we are in right now, had shifted, not only because of a greater antiquarian interest for Rome's ancient monument, but also because of the transfer of the relics of the martyrs from the catacombs to intramural churches that had taken place by now. And in the final part of my presentation, I am going to give a short overview of the Sylogae of the two of these Sylogae, Tur and Laures Hamensis, and also compare them a bit with the Einsiedeln manuscript and try to see how we can understand them and their aim. The Syloge of Tur mainly collects inscriptions in the catacombs and basilicas outside the walls, in accordance with the itineraries of the 7th century. The inscriptions in this collection are furthermore arranged in the same topographical order as in the Notitia Ecclesiarum, clockwise from the north, ending in San Pietro. In the very end of the collection, a few inscriptions from inside the city are also listed, as you can see here in the image. Inscriptions from Santi Apostoli here in the vicinity, Santi Cosma e Damiano and Santa Maria Maggiore, and one inscription from the Vatican, which is the funerary inscription of the Anglo-Saxon King Cedwalla in the portico of St. Peter's. So here we can clearly see that the topographical and epigraphical networks of knowledge are clearly intertwined. The sylloge, in its structure, carries also topographic information in itself. So the manuscript where this sylloge is preserved is, as we saw, from 12th century, but believed to go back on a source from the 7th century. And given the relation between the sylloge and the Notitia Ecclesiarum root, this in fact seems very probable. But even if Tours covers a lot of extramural inscriptions, it doesn't cover all of them. If we look at the number of Damasus inscriptions included in this sylloge, we get this picture. So not at all as many inscriptions as those we know that Damasus produced. Yet, if we skip between the two pictures, we can see that yet Tours was in many of these places, but obviously did not transcribe any Damasus inscriptions that we knew were there. Does this mean that already by now many of the Damasus inscriptions already were lost? Or was the author of the Sylloge of Tours just not interested in these inscriptions? We cannot know for sure, but it is very fascinating to think about. If we now move on to the other sylloge I wanted to go in depth with, the Sylloge Laures Hamensis, we have a manuscript dated to the 9th century, but then clearly something has happened to the topographical networks, because the first part contains inscriptions mainly inside the city of Rome, beginning with first several inscriptions from San Pietro, then a little tour inside the city of Rome, and then for the second part of the sylloge, returning to the Vatican again with a list of papal funerary inscriptions from the portico of old San Pietro. So if both the practice of epigraphic production and the collecting of epigraphic texts tell us something about how pilgrims and travelers moved and what they considered to be important knowledge, this pattern shows us that something transformative had happened. Not only can we see the same effects as in the Einsiedeln manuscript of the transfer of relics from the catacombs outside the walls to churches inside the walls, but also the introduction of a very brand new epigraphic area, so to speak, the portico of San Pietro, with the funerary monuments of the popes, who had begun to be buried there from the late 6th century and on. Something that Professor Bucarelli has studied in his edition of these epigraphs in this splendid publication, Hic Requiescit Papa. And there you also see a map of Old St. Peter's with the portico in the lower part of the picture, where many of these epigraphic monuments were to be found. So let's now take a look at how the Einsiedeln manuscript handles the topography and the inscriptions. Here is a map where I have reconstructed the itineraries of the Einsiedeln itinerary. It is the lines that you see in the image. And I have also marked out all of the inscriptions that are found in the sylloge part of the Einsiedeln. And I also marked out the era of the inscriptions. Red are the oldest ones, 1st to 3rd centuries, Common Era. Green, late antique, 4th to 5th centuries, and yellow, medieval inscriptions. And here we can clearly see that the distribution of all these inscriptions all more or less are orientated along the various itineraries of the same manuscript. Thus, both the itineraries, with their inclusion of the ancient Roman monuments, and the inscription collection mirror a new approach to Roman topography for the medieval visitor. And in my view, they also attest to the Carolingian making of Rome as a kind of cultural heritage inclusive place, as a palimpsest upon which Christian Rome then is laid out. And as the inscription collection follows the itineraries, just as the inscriptions in the Syllog of Tours follow the Notitia Ecclesiarum itinerary, it seemed to be mirroring the actual patterns of movement, not the movement of centuries before, but really the actual movement and the actual topography from when the manuscript was produced. If we go back just quickly to the Sylloge Laures Hamensis, you can see that it includes inscriptions from inside Rome, from the Portico of San Pietro, also interestingly from some other Italian cities, which the Einsiedeln Sylloge also does. And in the last part of the Laures Hamensis manuscript, we find inscriptions from the Catacomb of Rome, yet not in topographical order. So it seems to me that this is not just a transcription of older Sylloge, which were focused on the circular movement around Rome, because when you come to the catacomb inscriptions, they appear all mixed. They have gone from being topographical markers to being just texts, not perhaps any more epigraphical monuments, but informative texts about saints, but there isn't this need to place them in an exact location. So let's move forward again and to some conclusions and further questions. When thinking about how both the epigraphic production and, so to speak, the epigraphic reception were active in this period in Rome, I think that it could be useful to think along with these concepts. Something I call areas of use, areas of epigraphic production, and areas of epigraphic reception. So areas of use, that was the situation before Damasus made his inscriptions. There were already the catacombs. They were already visited. So there was an active use. There was Macmullen's sense of audience, and it was that which led to the next phase, the epigraphic production. And this is true both for Damasus and Honorius. And when this epigraphic production is there, when it is in place, then comes the period of epigraphic reception, which you can see mirrored in, for example, the Sylloge. All of the visitors, readers, reading and transcribing these inscriptional corpuses. And it is through this that you can see how the areas of use also shift in the various parts of Rome over time. By studying the itineraries and inscriptions together, and by tracing and comparing topographical or untopographical structures in the text, that can help us to understand more about both an approximate date and the aims of each single collection of text, rather than that they all should derive from the same original Sylloge. We must see each of them as carrying its separate aims of the epigraphic collections. Are they really only passively repeating information, or do they transform older knowledge in accordance with updated needs? And finally, through both epigraphic production and epigraphic reception, both the popes and the authors of the Sylogai could create specific areas of memory, worship, and knowledge, because by making an epigraphic program, as Damasus and Honorius did, but also by collecting inscriptions from a certain area and or in a certain thematic way, you give a new meaning to the place that you describe. And when you have produced this new epigraphic text or Sylogy text, the place in turn gets a new meaning because it has become a memory monument or a literary monument through these very texts. And that is pretty much what I was going to tell you about tonight. Thank you for your attention.